Sati, a term popularly associated with the practice of widow self-immolation, has remained a deeply controversial and fiercely contested issue for over 2 centuries. Both academically and popularly, it is said that sati is an inherent evil of Hinduism. And that Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a social and religious reformer, collaborated with the British and played a key role in abolishing the practice of sati. Is this true? For over a millennium, Buddhism actively engaged with Hinduism, offering sharp critiques on various aspects of its doctrines and practices to assert its own path. Despite this vigorous intellectual sparring and focus on social issues, the Buddhist texts never mention the practice of sati. Why? The Bhakti movement began in Tamil Nadu in the 6th century, spread all over India and continued well into the 17th century. The movement that fought against various social evils and engaged in various social, cultural and religious reforms saw several reformers and gurus. While they fought against various social evils, none of them mentioned the practice of sati. Why? Turkic and Mongol rulers held significant influence in India for several centuries. Yet, the practice of sati was never mentioned during this period. Why? However, the propaganda and narrative surrounding the practice of sati began to emerge only with the arrival of the British and the establishment of the Serampore mission in 1800 CE. This happened at a time when both the British and the missionaries were attempting to justify their presence in India and the need for colonization. Meanwhile, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a prominent social and religious reformer, witnessed his sister-in-law being forced to commit sati by his own family members, an event that deeply affected him and sparked his lifelong commitment to abolishing the practice. Raja Ram Mohan Roy joined the association of several British officials and missionaries, who were also seeking the support of the East India Company to establish themselves. It is important to note that, until this period, the East India Company maintained a cautious distance from missionaries, whose efforts were seen as disruptive to local religious sensibilities. The association sent several letters to the British government, urging a change in their strategy. Finally, through the Charter Act of 1813, the British government persuaded the East India Company to allow missionaries and local reformers to officially civilize the Hindu. This civilizing mission was aimed at improving the moral character of the Hindus. The association then actively engaged in various social and educational reforms. Funds were allocated for this purpose, which provided the association with the necessary support and strength. And so, a widespread propaganda effort was launched to sink the boat of Hinduism. Misrepresentation, misinformation, lies, fakery, etc. were employed to portray Hinduism in poor light, and thus strengthen the cause and the existence of the syndicate and their mission. The false propaganda machinery employed various tools, including newspapers, periodicals, books, public meetings, and even communist ideals, to establish their own narratives. They focused on several perceived weaknesses of Hinduism. They attacked polygamy as though it were unique to the Hindus. They attacked child marriage as though it were unique to the Hindus. Because none of the perceived weaknesses of the Hindus were strong enough to justify the colonization, they chose to strengthen their narratives around the so-called practice of Sati. They exploited, misrepresented and sensationalized a few exceptional cases of widow self-immolation, mostly influenced by the practice of Johar, portraying these as synonymous with Hinduism. They even strengthened their propaganda by claiming to conduct a number of surveys over the next several years, of course employing fakery and misrepresentation. The culmination of all the propaganda was the passing of the Sati Regulation Act in 1829. The passing of this act convinced the British public that colonization was a necessary and beneficial intervention for the people of India. The success of the Sati Regulation Act of 1829 paved the way for the easy passage of the English Education Act of 1835, further justifying British intervention in India. The English Education Act of 1835, in turn, reinforced the narratives that had supported the Sati Regulation Act of 1829. Both acts, in turn, firmly established the notion that Hindu culture was inherently barbaric and that Western intervention was a godsend necessity. Macaulay say that Sanskrit education leads to darkness. But how? Sanskrit education produced universities, a full 1500 years before the West could see its first university. Sanskrit education had already made contributions across various scientific areas, including mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and numerous others. Indeed, Sanskrit education had fostered the wealth and prosperity that attracted the so-called redeemers, who came to loot and plunder. Macaulays declared that English education was what Indians needed, and that it would improve the moral character of Indians, and make them truthful and honest. But how? Considering the deaths they imposed through artificial famines, the massacres they inflicted on innocents, and the horrific forms of exploitation they engaged in, how could they possibly preach honesty and morality? Their very audacity in making such claims reveals their own barbaric and manipulative nature. When such audacious individuals or groups gain power and take control of key institutions, such as the education system, media, and the machinery of narrative construction, nearly 2 centuries, spanning 8 to 10 generations, is more than enough time to cement their version of events as accepted history. Over this extended period, carefully curated narratives can become deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness, often replacing fact with ideology, and leaving little room for alternative perspectives to survive. Over the following decades, the propaganda machinery, along with strategic use of the Education Act, was effectively employed to portray Hinduism in a negative light and entrench that perception in the public consciousness. They depicted Hinduism and its scriptures as crude, excessively lax, vague, malleable, effeminate, and morally corrupt, among other derogatory characterizations. Given such systematic distortion for nearly 2 centuries, spanning 8 to 10 generations, it is hardly surprising that they were able to establish the notion that Sati was an inherent and defining feature of Hinduism. Moreover, it is worth noting the self-defeating and self-contradictory nature of the Macaulay's narratives. Roy points out that widow burning lacked scriptural basis in ancient texts. Nevertheless, these narratives seek to demean, deride, demonize, and destroy the entirety of Hindu culture and its scriptures. They also acknowledge the practice was geographically limited, yet proceed to stereotype the entire Hindu culture as evil and barbaric. These inconsistencies imply a motivation to destroy the culture, not to reform it. So, is Sati an inherent practice of Hinduism? Certainly not. Sati was never a practice of Hinduism. Instead, acts of widow self-immolation were rare, isolated incidents, mostly influenced by the practice of johar or other exceptional circumstances. Sati is nothing more than a hoax and false propaganda that exaggerated and sensationalized these exceptional cases of self-immolation of widows to project it as fundamental to the nature of Hinduism. Further, the false propaganda machinery misrepresented and manipulated scriptures to justify their narrative. Further, to portray that Roy collaborated with the British to abolish Sati is as good as saying Roy collaborated with the looters and plunderers to enlighten and preach to the Hindus about non-violence and not stealing. First and foremost, the colonizers traveled halfway across the globe, not because Indians were starving and barbaric, but the colonizers were. There can be no smoke without fire. Ingrain the following statements in your mind. Thomas Babington Macaulay says, "I do not think we would ever conquer this country, unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage." G.D. Trevelyan, a biographer of Thomas Babington Macaulay, says, "A new India was born in 1835. The very foundations of her ancient civilization began to rock and sway. Pillar after pillar in the edifice came crashing down." When the motivations of the colonizers and the missionaries are such crystal clear, and when their joint mission to civilize Hindus was nothing more than a mutually beneficial endeavor to control the political, economic, and religious imperialistic landscape of India, trusting their narratives is like a fox leading the sheep to its den in good faith. By depicting so-called Sati as a barbaric and backward practice, the colonizers not only justified Western intervention, but also reinforced a colonial mindset that sought to deride, demonize, and dismantle Hindu culture, while presenting Western culture as morally superior. Our so-called reformers like Roy, who were nothing more than collaborators, were no saints or paragons of virtue either. When the heart of so-called father of the Indian Renaissance does not even weep for the 10 million killed by the colonizers in artificial Bengal famine of 1769, but suddenly bleeds for the few hundred alleged instances of so-called Sati, it challenges reasoning. When 10 million deaths does not shake and propel him against the colonizers, but few hundred unfortunate deaths drive him crazy to the point of collaborating with those colonizers against Hindus, we must question the motives. But what can we expect from a reformer who writes to his friend that conquest is very rarely an evil, when the conquering people are more civilized than the conquered? effectively implying that the British were more civilized than the Hindus, and that the British colonization of India was a boon in disguise and a necessary good to civilize and transform the Hindus. Indeed, the portrayal of Roy as a Hindu reformer itself is a hoax. During a visit to Srirampur, after relating an anecdote regarding childhood tales of Sri Krishna, in which 2-year-old baby Krishna steals the butter, Roy expresses the following highly derogatory remarks about Sri Krishna. "The sweeper of my house would not do such an act. And can I worship a god sunk lower than my menial servant, the man who washes my water closet?" A person who has such a pathetic and vile thought process and understanding of baby Krishna, can we even consider him a Hindu, let alone a Hindu reformer? Besides, Roy's views on Shiva, Vishnu and Brahma elsewhere is also highly derogatory. If the credibility of the reformer itself is questionable, how credible can the narratives promoted and established by these reformers be? Furthermore, getting back to 1811, the portrayal that Roy was highly influenced by the self-immolation of his sister-in-law itself is highly questionable. It seems almost like a standard protocol of Macaulay's that reformers must first become personal victims of the cause they intend to fight, in order to justify how they were compelled to take up the mantle of reform. Roy is no exception. Roy is portrayed as a victim of the so-called Sati before he seriously became the reformer fighting against the practice. Of course, it is a deep personal tragedy, a historical incident of Sati, always highlighted in the discussion on Sati, and one that supposedly gave birth to a reformer. Even hypothetically, if we consider the so-called Sati a valid tradition, still the standard pattern of so-called reformers continues to haunt. Roy's great-grandfather, Krishna Chandra Banerjee, was a notable Mughal courtier, serving as the collector of the Hooghly and Burdwan districts, and was awarded the title Roy or Raya for his services. This title later became the family name, replacing Banerjee. Roy's grandfather, Braha Binodi Roy, worked in the court of Siraj-ud-Dowla, while his father, Ramakant Roy, also joined the Nawab's court and rose to prominence. This illustrious lineage highlights that Roy came from a well-established and influential elite family. His mother was equally notable, being a well-educated woman, and so were his brothers. The question remains, how did such an elite family adopt the regressive tradition of Sati? How could such a family force the sister-in-law to commit the practice of Sati? But wait, if at all the family was conservative, and if committing the practice of Sati was a custom or tradition in his family, then how is it that his mother did not follow the tradition when her husband, Roy's father, passed away in 1803? Could it be that Mr. Roy had not yet planned to become a reformer at that time? In fact, Roy's mother went on to become a strong and independent woman, taking control of the family affairs after her husband's death, even prosecuting Mr. Roy in a court over a property dispute. Besides, Roy's father was a Vaishnavite who worshipped Lord Vishnu, while his mother, Tarini Devi, came from a Shakta background, which involved the worship of the goddess Shakti. Hypothetically, even if we accept that the practice of Sati, based on Devi Sati, was considered a religious mandate, such a practice would typically be associated with devotees of Shiva, that is, Shaivites. So how is it that a Vaishnavite and a Shakta would adopt a Shaivite tradition like the practice of Sati, if they were indeed so conservative in their religious practices? How can I provide answers to these questions when I'm not a skilled storyteller like the Macaulays have proven to be? So, if the incident of Roy's sister-in-law did not propel him towards the Sati propaganda, what else did? That is your food for thought. The answer lies in the video. Ponder over it and comment. So, did Roy collaborate with British to abolish Sati? Certainly not. The British and the missionaries had their own benefits in eradicating the Hindu culture. It is obvious that the so-called reformers too were hand in gloves with the system. Therefore, more than a mission to reform, theirs was a mission to deform Hinduism. They framed Sati as a symbol of Hinduism's barbaric and backward traditions. They used this as a justification for colonial rule, claiming the British had a moral duty to civilize Hindus. When a depraved plunderer, who has colonized our country, testifies the moral character of Hindus, it is not only a joke, it is a perverse mockery of justice, a grotesque display of hypocrisy, and chilling example of perpetrators' audacity. When such is the case, to believe in their propaganda, to state that so-called Sati was advocated and endorsed by Hinduism, is a joke. If we believe in this joke, then we are the jokers, they are not. It is time to decide, are you a joker?